The hero of day 2 was, of course, Gukesh, the world champion from India. And first game I want to show you is between Nodirbek Abdusadorov, the Uzbekistan grandmaster, against Gukesh. Gukesh is playing black. Abdusadorov starts with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. We have a Nimzo defense. Queen c2, all theory so far, d5 strike in the middle, a3 attacking the bishop, and bishop takes the knight on c3, all theory. Queen takes c3, short castle, knight develops to f3 for Nodirbek, knight to d7 for Gukesh, and bishop g5, pinning the knight for white. b6, the white's light square bishop is going to be developed through either of those two squares. Exchange of the pawns on d5, and Nodirbek plays e3. All logical. The light square bishop has to go into the game. c5 and bishop b5. And the threat is to take the knight on d7 and then to take the pawn on c5, because a pawn on c5 is protected by the knight and the pawn. But if you eliminate the defender, the knight on d7, then the pawn on c5 would be hanging. And Gukesh plays h6. He attacks the bishop, bishop moves back to h4, and a5. So he doesn't really pay attention to the threat. Gukesh attacks the rook on a8 with the bishop. Rook moves away, and he exchanges the pawns on c5, and now he takes the knight on d7. Rook takes d7, and he grabs a pawn on c5 and makes a crucial mistake of the game. He has an extra pawn, but a totally losing position after a brilliant move, bishop a6. Bishop a6 prevents white from castling. Now white cannot castle short side because of this monster bishop. They cannot really castle long side either, because they would be immediately attacked by black pieces. They will actually lose the queen right away. So this position is very difficult already to play for Nodirbek. He goes with queen e4, d4, g5. Aggressive move, attacking the bishop. Bishop moves back, and knight e4. This move computer doesn't like, and actually this position already considered to be even, despite the fact that the king is so vulnerable in the middle. Rook c1, putting the rook on an open file, all logical, and queen a8. Queen d1, the queen goes back to let the knight take a very nice juicy square on d4, but this position is totally lost for white immediately after the move queen d1, because black could actually play here d4 and open up the position, open all the files, D and E files, and the king, the white king, will not survive. They will not survive this assault. Instead, rook c8, that move was pretty passive. Knight goes to d4 where it wanted to go. Knight c5, and now the threat is knight d3 with the check and the fork. And Nodirbek plays a rook c2, protecting himself at least from losing a rook. a4, putting more pressure on white, is Gukesh. And king d2. Very strange move for white. I see the idea. I can understand the idea. The king on e1 is very, very vulnerable. And Nodirbek wants to put it in a safe place, kind of do artificial castle to the queen side. But it takes too long, and black Gukesh dismantles white's position pretty easily after a rook b7, kind of hinting that, Nodirbek, if you put your king somewhere here, my rooks are gonna just crush you. Nodirbek plays queen c1, attacking the knight on c5, but simply bishop c4, blocking that whole battery, f3 for white, and it's just a matter of time. Queen a5 check, king moves away to d1, and knight goes to b3. White can do nothing in this position. Queen is under attack. They cannot take the knight on b3, because after bishop takes b3, the rook on c2 is pinned and is gonna be lost, and not just the exchange, but the whole rook. Plus, there would be a checkmate very quickly. So after knight b3, white plays bishop e1, attacking the opposing queen on a5, but it doesn't help because queen simply moves away to a6. And in this position, on move 27, and Nodirbek resigns. Nodirbek resigns because really cannot do anything here. The queen is under attack. If the queen goes, let's say, to b1, knight would simply take on d4, and bishop b3 with the same idea, losing a rook. So that's pretty much how the game ended. It was an easy win for Gukesh. Nodirbek is not having a good tournament at all. And let's take a look at another game. And again, Gukesh playing white this time against probably the best, or at least the second best, American grandmaster Fabiano Caruana. And Gukesh starts with, Gukesh starts with knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, e6, and c4. If black takes the pawn on c4, then queen a4 check, and the pawn will be captured back. So in this position, there is no use to capture the pawn on c4, and black plays bishop e7. b3, the bishop is going to be developed on this nice diagonal for Gukesh. Caruana plays castle, bishop b2, and c5. Caruana gains the center with his pawn. Exchange of the pawns on d5, knight develops to c3, knight to c6, developing moves, and h4, the first aggressive move of the game. Gukesh is gaining some space on the king side of the board. Knight goes back immediately to f6, castle for Gukesh, and e5. And Caruana's position, according to the computer, is slightly better here. e5 is a nice move. e4 is actually on the horizon. Rook c1. Bishop develops to f5. Very nice diagonal for the bishop. d3. Blocking, at least somehow. The bishop, rook goes to an open file on c8, and knight goes to d2. Knight goes back, possibly to reroute it to a square e4, but it's a little too slow. And Fabiano plays bishop e6. He wants to put his knight on d5, possibly. White plays knight c4 and knight g4 for Caruana. His position remains slightly better. e3, h5, just to support that knight on g4 with the pawn also. Queen e2, a6, preparing the move b5. That was not possible because the square was protected by the knight. Rook d1 and b5, attacking the knight. The knight was on a nice square on c4, but now has to come back to d2. And just visually, you can see that black's position is more pleasant, especially after the move f5. Well, you can see that Fabiano's pawns are very active, all on the 5th rank, and pretty much every single piece in Gukesh's position is on the first 3 rows of the board. So his position is very passive at this. Knight f3, bishop f6, and that was a mistake. That was a mistake because the move bishop f6 immediately ran into d4. d4 is a great move to strike in the middle, and the thing is, although black has more attackers on the pawn on d4, they cannot win this pawn because after, let's say, those 2 exchanges, the bishop on e6 is hanging, and that's very important. So in this position, black plays e4, attacking the knight on f3. The knight could go away, but d5 is a nice strike again in the middle, forking the knight and the bishop. Black takes the knight, the queen is under attack, so the queen has to take it. The bishop has to take it. Bishop takes f3. The fork remains. Fabiano plays knight e5. White takes the pawn on e6 and attacking the queen on d8. Knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, and the queen moves away to e7. And now we have a position where white, first of all, has an extra pawn. That's important, and also a preferable, much more pleasant position connected with the fact that the knight could jump to d5, and that would create big problems for black. And that's exactly what Gukesh does. He plays knight d5, attacking the queen, and unfortunately for black, the move queen takes e6 doesn't really work. But that's pretty much the only move remaining in this position. So queen takes e6, and here, attention, queen takes, first of all, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, and now queen takes f5. What a move. Queen takes f5, sacrificing the queen, yes, only for one move, but still looks great. Queen takes f5, knight e7, triple fork, king moves away to h7, knight takes f5, and rook c7. We have an endgame where Gukesh has an extra pawn, very active rook on a d-file, very active knight. This position is winning for white, but it's not that easy, especially against Caruana, who is one of the best defenders in the game. So the game continued for quite a long time, and Gukesh had to prove that he is very, very good at endgames, and this was very instructional, actually. So the knight on d6 is under attack, e5, defending the knight, attacking the knight on f6, knight e4. Here, white have to be careful because if they take the knight, they will lose a rook. Rook e1, and now still an extra pawn for white. If Caruana took the pawn on d6, then a rook would take on c5. Therefore, Caruana decided first to protect the pawn on c5, and then he was thinking later he would take the pawn on d6, but rook e5, another great move, attacking both pawns at the same time, the pawn on h5, the pawn on c5, king at h6 defending one of the pawns but cannot defend the other, and after these exchanges we still have one extra pawn for Gukesh, and usually in rook endgames, especially 3-on-2 on the same side, and those are drawish type of endgames, but Gukesh was marvelous here. King f1, the rook defends the e-file, so it doesn't allow the king to get into the middle of the board as it should, where the king should go at the endgames. a4, change of the pawns here, g6, and a5, blocking the pawn on a6. King g7, king g2, rook f6. Fabiano desperately trying not to allow the king to get to the middle of the board, but after rook c7, king h6, rook a7, now attacking this pawn on a6, so the rook from f6 has to be glued to defending this pawn, otherwise black is completely lost. Rook c6, and now you see the king actually escapes and goes to where it needs to go. So basically in this position, black are in a zugzwang here. They have no moves. The king cannot move to any of those squares, and the rook cannot move on the f-file because the pawn on a6 would be hanging. Therefore, rook c6, and the king goes forward. King f3, king f4, king e4, king d4. The king is going f4, that was protecting the pawn. Rook c2 check, king d5, another check, rook, king e5, rook, another check. So here some moves were repeated. Both players have less than a minute to go in the game, so they needed to put some more time on the clock. Remember that there is 10-second increments, so 10 seconds is added to each move played. Rook d3, attacking the pawn on g3, but it doesn't matter already because rook takes a6. Rook takes g3, king b7, and in this position, Fabiano Caruana resigned because he cannot protect from a pawn getting queening on a square a8, so Fabiano would have to lose his rook for this pawn and obviously lose a game. Another brilliant performance by Gukesh, especially his endgame technique, was absolutely marvelous. Another game I want to show you is between Alireza Firouzja, French Grandmaster, against Giri from Netherlands. Both are also household names. Firouzja starts with d4, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, e6, knight f3, all developing moves. Bishop e7, castle, castle, a3, prophylactical move h6 to give the king the escape square just in case, c4, striking in the middle, c6. This is the typical Slav defense type of triangle of pawns. Knight develops to c3, knight d7, and knight goes back to d2 with the idea to play the move e4 to control the center of the board. But Giri is first. He plays e5, striking in the middle first. Exchange of the pawns on e5, exchange of the pawns on d5, and knight goes to b3, possibly to go to a very nice square d4. Instructional moment here. There is a pawn on d5 which is isolated. It's not protected by any of black pawns. And if the opponent has an isolated pawn, you want to put your knight in front of it. And that's exactly what Alireza wants to do. Bishop a6 and knight goes to d4. Queen d7, queen b3, rook develops to d8, exchange of the minor pieces on e6, and the move e4. Computer absolutely hates this move because if d takes e4, then the pawn on e6 is going to be very, very weak, and white's position is going to be better. But, of course, this is not checkers. Giri does not take the pawn, and he moves his pawn forward, gaining space, attacking the knight. Knight has to go back to e2, and g5, very nice move, protecting the square f4, so the knight cannot get to the square f4 to attack the pawn on e6. Alireza attacks the pawn with the bishop though, bishop h6. And here, the best move for black, believe it or not, is not to try to even protect that pawn, but to play king h8. And Giri plays that move, king h8. The fact that the pawn on e6 is not protected is not an issue. And after bishop g2, black plays bishop c5. Now, what would happen if white would have taken on e6, then queen e8, and apparently this position is totally winning for black. But this is really complicated stuff, so let's not go there. Obviously, on our level, you definitely take the pawn on e6, but 2700 grandmasters see the board, see chess much better, and Giri plays, Alireza plays bishop g2, bishop c5, activating the bishop, h3, and d3 now. d3 attacking the knight, and knight c3. Now you would think that d2 simply winning the game because it's winning the bishop, but in reality, this is actually the move that would have given white hope, because after bishop takes d2, and now if queen takes d2, believe it or not, white is winning, because after rook d1, I'm sorry, not after this rook to d1, the queen is trapped and has no moves. So white would have won this game, interestingly enough. So d2 would have been a big mistake. But Giri, of course, sees it and plays knight h5, which is a very nice attacking move, attacking the pawn on g3. The pawn on f2 is pinned, and knight h5 attacks the pawn. Bishop e3 kind of defends it, but not really, because bishop takes e3, f takes e3, knight takes g3. Black's position is totally dominating. Exchange of the rooks on f8, queen b4. Giri doesn't blunder the rook. He plays queen f7, creating this battery on the f file, getting ready to penetrate into white's camp. Queen d4, that's another move to attack something, to create some issues for black. Queen d4 attacks the knight on e5 and it pins it, but simple queen f6 solves all the problems. King h2, rook d8 attacking the queen on d4, and queen c5. And now knight goes to e2. Again, this position is totally winning for black, but obviously you need to continue to play and see that black can transform their big advantage to actual win. Rook f1 attacking the queen. Queen just goes back to g7, continuing to protect the knight on e5, knight b5, and g4. g4 to open up all the files to get to the white king. h4 makes sense. It kind of blocks black's attempts, but knight f3 check. Bishop takes f3, and pawn takes f3, and in this position, white, Alireza Firouzja, resigned. They resigned because there is a checkmate coming on g2 with the queen, and if, for example, rook takes f3, then queen g1 check, king h3, queen h1 check, king g4, rook g8 check, king h5. These are the only moves. Queen takes f3, check, and f6, and finally queen g6 checkmate. So there could have been a very nice checkmate, but Alireza Firouzja decided not to test Giri knowledge of simple tactics, and he resigned. The next game I want to show you is again Gukesh, world champion, and this is of course the game of the day, if not the whole tournament. Magnus Carlsen, the best of the best, plays white. Gukesh plays black. Magnus Carlsen, in some recent interviews, was hinting on the fact that Gukesh is not a real world champion because he didn't have to play the best player to get his title, and the best player is Magnus Carlsen himself. So any time Magnus Carlsen plays Gukesh, it's always a spectacle. And Magnus starts with the English opening c4, e5 for Gukesh, knight c3, bishop b4, knight f3 developing the knight, immediate exchange of the bishop for the knight for Gukesh, and d6, and the light square bishop is gonna go maybe to g4, maybe to f5, e4 for Magnus, knight d7, position play, bishop d3, knight develops to c5. Knight looks pretty good here. The bishop is looking pretty ugly, stuck between his own pawns. Bishop c2, knight develops to f6, preparing the castling, queen e2, a5, aggressive move by Gukesh on the queen side of the board, knight d2, knight goes back, so Magnus plays pretty passively, but obviously position is even. g6, knight f1, so it's a maneuver of the knight, probably to go to e3 and then a nice square on d5, bishop e6, bishop g5 to pin the knight to the queen, pretty, and the pin is not really the one that Gukesh likes, because you cannot move the queen to d7, let's say. The knight would be hanging. So he plays h6, immediately asking this bishop to move away, bishop h4 and g5. So he immediately escapes the pin, bishop g3, and now queen d7. And now Gukesh can castle either short side or long side, f3. White bishop really doesn't have anything to do on this diagonal. So on this diagonal, it will look much better. Knight h5, knight e3, and knight f4. Very juicy square for the knight for Gukesh on f4. Queen d2, queen had to move away because it was under attack. b5 for Gukesh. White king is still in the middle of the board, so you need to do something, and b5 is a very nice way to start attacking. Knight goes to d5, where it wanted to go a long time ago. Bishop immediately grabs that knight because the knight on d5 was monster. C takes d5, and knight goes back to h5. That move is not exactly understandable. Computer doesn't like it either. And what's interesting that this position computer thinks it's even, but after this one move, which is obviously not a blunder or anything, computer shows plus 1.3 for white. So this position for Magnus is already better. Usually, Magnus transfers this position into winning pretty easily. So let's see what happened. Bishop f2, h4 was much better move to immediately open the h file for the rook. King goes to f8. So Gukesh decided not to castle, but castle artificially, so to say, and move the king to f8 and then to g7, so to castle this way. g3, king g7, and bishop goes to e3 with some maybe ideas of sacrificing that bishop on g5. Therefore, Gukesh decided to protect the pawn on g5 with queen e7, rook g1, and knight f6. Now would be nice for white to play f4 to open all the files to get to the black king, but f4 right now is impossible to play because both knights are attacking the pawn on e4. So the pawn on e4 would be lost, and that wouldn't be good for white. b4, that move looks good, but computer doesn't like it. Exchange of the pawns on b4, and knight jumps to the edge of the board on a4. Computer still thinks this position is better for white. Bishop d3, attacking the weakness, attacking the pawn on b5. Gukesh sacrifices the pawn on c6. Magnus takes it, and now Gukesh plays d5. That's a great move, because again, the king is in the middle, in the center of the board, and very easily could be a target for the opposing pieces, and d5 tries to open the files to get to the white king. Exchange of the pawns on d5, a3 had to be played because the pawn on b4 was attacked by two pieces. Rook goes to d8. That's a very dangerous rook now, kind of x-raying the white pieces, the bishop and the queen. Rook c1, bishop d6, and rook d6, and bishop takes b5. Again, computer doesn't like it, but on the other hand, Carlsen has two extra pawns now. Two extra pawns, and Gukesh, and Gukesh's position, he has to make very precise moves because the pawn on c6 is very well protected and it's a very dangerous pass pawn. Bishop on b5 serves its purpose, and again, two extra pawns. But again, the king on e1, very, very weak. Knight c3. Knight c3 is precise move here, attacking at the same time the queen and attacking the bishop on b5. Bishop c5, a little craziness on the board. Bishop c5, everything is under attack. Knight takes the bishop on b5. Bishop takes the rook on d6. Knight takes the bishop on d6. And we have a position in which black has two knights for a rook, but again, white has 6 pawns against 4. Crazy position. Computer says it's even. Nothing to worry about. King f2, knight b6, queen d3, and queen e6. Queen e6 with the goal to get the queen to h2, to h3. And it was very important to protect that square with the move king g2. But Magnus didn't do it. He played a rook c5, and that ran immediately into the move e4, which is great strike in the middle, and now white cannot take the pawn because they will lose a rook. Knight will take the pawn with the check, with the fork, and capture the rook on c5. So rook c5 was really a bad move. Queen d4 check, king g8, and a rook d1. Rook d1 attacking the knight on d6. But this position is already very, very difficult for white. Why it's difficult? Because black take, first of all, the pawn on f3. And now, important to notice that white cannot take the knight because they will be checkmated in two moves like this. So you cannot take the knight on d6, and Magnus makes a critical mistake here. He plays rook e5, and after rook e5, he could have resigned right away. Important to notice that Magnus had 27 seconds on the clock, Gukesh had 5 minutes, and under pressure, Magnus, he is human after all, made a big mistake. Rook e5 is a mistake. Why? Queen h3. Queen h3, remember we discussed it, that it was the idea a couple of moves ago. And now this is really scary for white because pawn on h2 is under attack. Queen g2 is the threat. Magnus plays king takes f3, gets a fork with knight c4, attacking the rook. Most importantly, the rook from a8 is ready to grab the pawn on a3 with the check and the quick checkmate there. So Magnus plays rook a5 to protect himself at least from immediate checkmate. So he has to sacrifice that rook. Gukesh takes that rook. And after queen f5 check, king g2, queen c2 check, king g1, and knight f5, it's clear that white are not gonna defend their king. Queen d7 and knight e3, attacking the rook and attacking the checkmate on g2. White plays rook d2, seemingly defending from both threats at the same time, but check from c1, check from g4, and you cannot take that knight because the rook would be hanging and black would be simply with an extra rook. King e2 and knight e5, centralizing the knight, all black pieces. And actually, black are playing with the queen and the knight, but they're so great in coordination that they basically decide the game, because the rook on a8 actually never moved in this game. So it's queen and knight against queen and rook. You would think that this would be advantage white, advantage Carlsen, but again, the king is too weak here in the center. Queen had to move away, and it did move away to e7. Knight simply takes the pawn on c6, attacking the queen again. Queen has to come back to e4, and rook takes a5, and Magnus Carlsen resigned. He resigned because too many threats. Too many threats. First of all, rook e5 is the main threat, pinning the queen to the king, winning the material here, and none of the other moves would really help. If queen goes anywhere, let's say to f3, then still rook e5 check and winning the rook. So again, another beautiful game by Gukesh, especially important here because he beat the former world champion and probably the best player of all time, Magnus Carlsen. And let's take a look at the standings after day 2. And not surprisingly, we see Gukesh Dommaraju with 10 points and a solid first place. Second place belongs to a Polish grandmaster, Jan Krzysztof Duda. A little bit of a surprise. Obviously, very strong grandmaster, but look at the roster with Pragnananda, Caruana, Lireja. So you wouldn't expect Duda to be second after day 2, but he is. Wesley Saw, another little surprise. He is third. Magnus Carlsen is only fourth. The biggest surprise might be Ivan Saric from Croatia, who was added to this tournament just because he is the host of the tournament. He's from Croatia. His rating is much lower than everyone else here, but he is on the 5th place. He is tied with Anish Giri. Pragnananda didn't have the greatest start, and he has 5 points, 7th place. Fabiano Caruana, same 5 points. Alireza, 4. And Nodirbek Abdusadorov, 10th place with 3 points. Very strong grandmaster, but the tournament is not going his way so far. Tomorrow is day 3. Thank you very much for watching. I know it was a long video, but I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned something. And like, subscribe, leave me a comment. Let me know if you think Gukesh is really deserving world champion, although he didn't have to beat Magnus to become one. I would be interested in your opinion on that. Again, thank you for watching. See you soon.